Robert Weiss, PhD, is a clinical officer of Seeking Integrity, LLC, clinical programs that provide online education and residential treatment for sex, porn, and substance / sex addicted men and their families. Rob is a psychotherapist and addiction specialist, and he has created 6 intimacy and addiction treatment programs in the U.S., Southeast Asia, and the U.S. military. Dr. Weiss is the online host of Digital Addiction on A&E. As I mentioned, Dr. Weiss's website is called Seeking Integrity. Rob has been in the rooms of 12-step recovery himself since 1985 and describes seeking integrity in terms of the meaning of the word integrity from the word integrated, the quality or state of being complete or undivided as his path in recovery. And I want to thank you, Rob, for all you do. I know that on your site, Seeking Integrity, you offer so many great free resources. And also added to that, your own personal journey gives a lot of power to your voice. Thank you for joining us today. Over to you, Rob.
Well, hi, guys, and thank you for the invite. I am unable to show you slides, so you're going to have to look at my handsome face this whole way through. However, so by the way, I'm here in California, where it is absolutely freezing. It's about 65 degrees, something like that Fahrenheit. And so as you see, I've got my sweater on because it's so cold, and my dog's at my feet just to keep my feet warm. I'm a my name is Rob, and I'm a recovering sex addict. Hi, Rob. And I'm sure you all said that. And I have been in the rooms, as was stated, since December 10th, 1985. And about 6 years later, I got my master's, and another 20 years later, I got my PhD. I've written 7 books. I've treated people all over the world. I've opened multiple treatment centers, and this is what my life's work has been. I don't have the ability to show slides for whatever reasons. We had a 2023 tech failure. So as I said, you're going to see my face, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through my slides. And the reason I want to do this is I don't want to miss anything for you. The first thing I want to say is I know there's a lot of folks here who are AA, and I want to tell you that I treat the exact same disorder that you are in recovery for. Everyone I treat is an addict. Trust me. They think like addicts. They act like addicts. They do things that are absolutely insane, just like the rest of us. And I think when you hear a little bit about this, you'll understand. So first of all, we have a diagnosis in pretty much in every country except the United States. And I'm just going to read you the diagnosis. Compulsive sexual behavior disorder, sex addiction, is characterized by a persistent inability to control intense, repetitive sexual impulses or urges, resulting in repetitive sexual behavior. The pattern manifests over an extended period of time, more than 6 months. It negatively affects familial, social, educational, and/or occupational areas of functioning. In individuals with symptoms of compulsive sexual disorder, the repetitive sexual activities may become an essential focus of their life to the point where they neglect health, personal care, family, interests, activities, and responsibilities. That's how it's classified. Other symptoms may include repetitive sexual behavior despite negative consequences, receiving little or no satisfaction from the behavior. That's a little bit about it. So one of the things I always like to ask is how much sex is a problem? If I have sex 3 times a day, 6 times a day, is that a problem? And I would say to you that we look at this the same way you look at alcoholism, which is for you, 2 drinks may be a drunk. For someone else, it may be 8 drinks, you're a drunk. I don't define compulsive gambling by how much you spend, because you may have 100 and someone else may have 10,000, but they're still sitting there at the casino. I don't define eating disorders by how many times you go eat. We don't look at it that way. So how much sex does not define sex addiction. And then people say, oh, okay, well, what kind of sex means addiction? Is it fetishes? Is it or sexual orientation? Is it, what defines sex as a problem? What kind of sex? My answer to you would be, well, what kind of alcohol makes you an alcoholic? Is it wine or whiskey? What kind of gambling makes you a gambling addict? Is it playing blackjack or craps? It doesn't matter. We don't define addiction by how much or what kind. We define addiction by qualitatively, how has this substance or behavior affected my life and my ability to function? I don't care how much you drink. It's none of my business unless you're driving drunk and hitting trees and, and getting arrested. And then I care about how much you're drinking. Everybody else, I don't really care about in terms of the work we do and what we're dealing with. Consequences for sex addiction go like this: loss of relationships, loss of marriages, absent parenting, little or no relationship intimacy, arrest, sexually transmitted diseases, loss of intimate sexuality, abuse, physical, emotional, mood swings, depression, anxiety, suicide, job loss, educational losses and failures. And the last two I mentioned, I think of those last two, educational loss and failures. These two, educational loss and failures, and the inability to form intimate relationships is what I see a lot with porn addicts. They are so involved with the computer and they are so isolated that they're not building relationships. They're not dating. They're not out there having sex with other people. In fact, porn addicts started their own 12-step program because they used to go to sex addiction meetings and we would talk about sex workers and affairs and massage parlors, and the porn addicts were like, but we want to do those things. We want to do those. That's not bad for us because all we do is sit in front of a screen. So they actually started their own program, just like NA and CA and all that stuff, because they needed to be with people who were struggling with the same thing they were. And in their case, I actually agree. Sex addiction is different than porn addiction, but the ultimate issue is the same. So how does a naturally occurring function like eating run off the rails into addiction? And what I'm going to say for sex addiction, it's biological. That when and I'll give you an example from drugs and alcohol. When I'm starting to think about going to see my dealer and how great it's going to be and how exciting it's going to be, if you were sitting with me in the automobile as I was driving to the dealer's house, you would notice that my heart is beating faster, that my hands are getting clammy or wet, that my pupils would be dilating, my hearing would be more acute, there'd be a little sweat trickling down my arms. I am so excited about getting there to the dealer. My breathing is shallow. I'm sweating. I have this feeling of rush or intensity, and I can't think as clearly because I am so hyper focused on this. How does that happen? Well, sex addiction clients talk about it like this. They call it being in the bubble. They call it being in the trance. They call it being spaced out. They'll say things like the car drove me there. And what they mean is, and I just want you to think about this in terms of the biology of it, is that when I get a rush of adrenaline, for example, we had an earthquake where I live, or you had a major disaster, my heart would race, my pupils would dilate, I would begin to sweat, and I wouldn't be able to think clearly because everything else would go out of my head except saving myself. I would have tunnel vision, and the only thing I could think about was running out the door or my family or whatever. That's what happens when you are this kind of an addict. And I think most addicts, everything runs out of your head. And vaguely you hear like my sponsor said, or my therapist said, or what's going to happen to my spouse. It doesn't matter because we're not working out of this part of our brain. We're functioning because of the adrenaline in a much more primitive, what do you call this when you can't see? Blinders, which are focusing on what we want. So as you know, with addiction, the addiction is a rock rolling downhill. So the closer you get to the desired object, the harder it gets. When I'm thinking about going to see sex workers while I'm on the computer, I start to get excited. Then I get the money. Then I get in my car. And by the time I'm at their place of business, it's nearly impossible for me to not do it because the biological escalation makes it harder and harder for me to make good decisions. And that's really how it works. Let's see, what do I have here? Give me just 1 second. Oh, I see what happened. So, let me say a moment. Just give me 1 second here. So, um, so, let me give it a little bit this way. Where does it come from? Nearly all of the people I work with, male and female, have early abuse and trauma. In particular, for sex addicts, especially the men that I work with, they're dealing with early parental enmeshment. In other words, basically, they were taken advantage of by a parent. They were used by a parent. They didn't really know who they were, but they sure learned what that parent needed and what that parent wanted. Um, they didn't get their needs met. They learned to use fantasy and escape because no one there was meeting their needs. And I got to tell you, as a sex addict growing up with a mentally ill parent, I learned how to make mom happy, make sure dad was okay, see what was going on in the scene, make sure I took care of myself because no one was taking care of me, not really. And I'm not saying I didn't have food on the table, but emotionally. And so as an adult, what I have learned is if I make people happy, if I do things on the outside to make people feel good about themselves, then I feel good inside of me. But inside of me, there isn't a sense of what brings me joy, what brings me happiness, what makes me feel good. I only feel good in relationship to people validating me, appreciating me, because that's how I learned I would get my needs met. And so for the addicts that I work with, their goal is a constant stream of attention. And it isn't enough to have a partner or a lover. They need to have, if my partner or my lover is gone away for the weekend, and I start to feel that abandonment and that loneliness and emptiness, I can't tolerate not getting validated, not getting attention, not being wanted. And so I run out and try to find the thing that will make me feel better. One of the things I think sex addiction is about is a term that I really like to use called controllable intimacy. Sex addicts think that they can manage or control uh, how they experience being wanted, being loved, being appreciated, and being validated. The truth is, you can't be intimate. That's an oxymoron. You can't have controllable intimacy. Intimacy, by its own nature, is letting go, being vulnerable. I'm not talking about sexual intimacy. I'm talking about relationship intimacy, and that's about being open, being vulnerable, having you know everything about me, risking that you won't love me, hoping that you'll love me no matter what. And as many of the spouses, and so when you say, how are you? And I say, fine, that is not intimate or vulnerable. When you say, how are you doing? And I say, well, I had a really hard day and this and that moves you toward me. Addicts are intimacy avoidant, sex addicts in particular. So we don't want to be close to our partners. We don't want to be intimate because we had trauma early on and we learned that that doesn't work or it won't be responsive or I'm going to get hurt. So we get what we can from our families and loved ones with a limit because we don't want to make ourselves vulnerable. And then we turn to controllable sexual situations where we get attention and validation, but we don't have to take any risks. No sex worker is going to let me down. No sex worker is going to make me feel unloved. It is a process uh, of imitating, if you will, the experiences that I really want without being able to actually achieve them with real people. And as a result, I'm empty because where I really need to go to get my needs met and be emotionally connected to that, I just keep that at a distance. And then I go over here to situations where I could never really get my needs and wants met. And I'm talking about important emotional needs. And so I split my life in half. But I never get fed. I never get supported. It's just like no matter how much you drink, you never really feel better because it's an empty promise. It's potato chips when you're hungry. It doesn't really meet the need. So I can have sex with as many people as I want. It's never really going to meet my need of support, nurturing, validation, and all those things we're looking for when we act out. Um, by the way, I am seeking a slide set. So if you see me sitting here, unfortunately, we were not able to get our slide set open. So, and that's a problem. So what else can I tell you about sex addiction? I want to tell you what the cycle of addiction is like. I start to think about it. I start to think, well, first of all, I'm having a bad day. Something is going wrong. I'm having some emotional trigger that I can't tolerate. And I start to go into fantasy and I start to think, oh, well, look, maybe I could do this and maybe I could do that. And wouldn't that be great? And I start to look at images on the computer and then I'm looking at sex workers. And then I get up and I start getting involved in the process of getting it together, telling my spouse I'm not going to be home, getting the money out, whatever it is. And then I engage in the act, whatever the act is. And of course, then I feel both shameful and better. The point of that is that the longest period of time I have to stop is before I actually do it. Because the most time that I spend in sex addiction is spent in the fantasy and in the ritual of setting it up. The sex may take 5 minutes, but that's a good relapse prevention piece because it means that I can engage in sex over and over and over again. Um, uh, I'm sorry, folks. I am desperately looking. You know what I'm going to do? Can you see me? Can you see me now? Say yes or no.
Yes.
Everybody's, oh, groovy. Okay, so I'm gonna actually go through my slides. Um, so let me try this. How do we achieve sobriety in sex addiction? How is it possible to do that? And I want to just briefly say that. Um, in alcohol and drugs, sobriety is you don't do it anymore. It's abstinence. With gambling, you don't go to fantasy football, you don't play the stock market, you don't go to casinos, you don't do any of that. So, how would you be able to define sexual sobriety? Would that be abstinence? Would that mean I don't have sex anymore? And that's not a good idea because sex is a naturally occurring function like eating. So when we have an eating disorder, we don't say to someone, stop eating. We say, what defines how you want to live your life? You know, I want to be healthy. I want to be, or let's talk in terms of sex. What defines how you want to live your life? I want to feel good about myself. I want to be honest. I don't want to lose my marriage. I want to get through school. I want to have a family and children. What goals do you have for your whole life? And then I'm going to sit down and say, well, what consequences or problems do you have in achieving these goals because of your sexual behavior? What sexual behavior leaves you unable to achieve the goals you want? For example, I'm looking at porn all the time and it keeps me from finishing my education because I'm looking at porn 3 hours a night. And so we list those as things that are our sobriety. When I don't do those things, I'm sober. And we do the same thing with food. You know, I don't go to buffets. I don't eat between meals. I don't eat sugar. And we set that up as sobriety. And if I cross the line into those behaviors, I'm not sober. On the other hand, I also want to list the things that are validating, nurturing, and that make me feel good. Some of those are sexual. But as you know, most alcoholics will say, what's the fun in life if I'm not drinking? And sex addicts say the same thing. If I ask a sex addict what their hobby is, they'll say having sex. If I'll say, what do I do? What do you do for fun? Well, I look for sex. They don't know, again, what's inside of them. So they don't even know what really brings them pleasure. What brings them pleasure is getting other people to validate them, want them. And, you know, I can pay for sex and I still have that same internal experience like I am getting validated, I am getting fed, I am getting what I need in this moment. So, you know, that bubble I talked about, that trance, that spaced out, that I'm in a high related to my fantasies and I'm in tunnel vision and all I can think about is getting to see that affair partner. In recovery, we have a word for that too. We call it powerlessness. I don't want to, I shouldn't, I know this isn't a good idea. I've told myself a million times I'm not going to do this. And yet I seem unable to not go to that sexual experience, masturbate for 5 hours to porn, go find that affair partner, and then cheat on my affair partner. I was just talking to a gentleman the other day. He's married and he was having 2 or 3 affairs. He'd been married 31 years. He'd have affairs for 30 of those years. His wife never knew. I run into people. It's interesting because you think porn problems, younger people. In our treatment center at the moment, I have 3 men who've been looking compulsively at porn for 25 or 30 years in whatever format it came. They're completely unavailable to meaningfully engage their relationships, relationship intimacy, connected sexuality. They're not involved with their families, their children, because they are so focused and obsessed with this. One of the things I do when I meet with a couple and I try to understand their issues, and I do consultations. So a couple will come to me for 2 hours and I will sit in front of this screen and I will work with them. And when I talk to a wife or a husband about what their experience of living with this sex addict has been, um, it's interesting because about this much, or maybe 15% of what they talk about is sex, cheating, affairs, you ruined my life. How could you do this to me? All that stuff. But 70 or 80% of what they talk about is you're not intimate. You're distant. You don't talk to me. You don't tell me what you're feeling. You don't tell me what you're sharing. You walk through our family, and yes, you may take the kid to school, or yes, you may do homework, but you're not there. And every man I work with who is a sex addict and who's married and has children, I will say to them, are you a good husband? And they will say, well, probably not. And then I'll say to them, are you a good father? And without fail, they'll say, well, of course, I've always been a good father. And the question is, and then my comment to them is, well, not really. And they don't like this. They do not like hearing that I say they're not a good father. And the reason they're not a good father is because they don't support their spouses. If I am not loving and supportive and available to help, let's say, my wife parent our children, then I've left her alone. And if she's having to parent alone and she's anxious about where I am and what I'm doing and all that stuff, then she can't be the parent that she needs to be. And so, yes, if I am acting out sexually, I am not being a good parent because I'm not supporting the mother of my children. And in that way, I'm creating the kinds of problems that lead to the generational aspects of addiction. I am not attending to my children. I am not completely present. And all of those kinds of things are going on. There is a difference between process addictions and substance addictions. So process addictions or behavioral addictions are like gambling, gaming, sex, eating, losing myself in those kinds of experiences. It's different than substance addiction because the way we look at it, it's the whole process that I'm addicted to. It's the excitement of thinking about what I might do. It's looking at the images or the thoughts about where I'm going. It's getting ready for it. The whole thing is the addiction to me because the end point, the sex, that's just the end point of it. But I'm excited all the way through. I'm distracted all the way through. I am focused on this all the way through. And as a result, I'm not available to those around me. I'm not thinking clearly about what I want to do or how I should do it. I am emotionally and psychologically unavailable. One of the things I think is important to say is that sex addiction is not about sex. And I know it's really hard for spouses and partners to understand this. If I'm loving an alcoholic, on some level, I know their drinking is not about me. I mean, I feel like if you love me, you wouldn't drink. If you loved our family, you wouldn't drink. All of that. I feel that way. But I understand you have a problem. But if you're having 3 affairs, if you're seeing sex workers, if you on a regular basis, if you are compulsively masturbating to porn, then it's personal. The spouse is unable to see the partner, the loved one. They're unable to see that this really isn't about me, that the person would have been doing this before they met me. They'll do it after they met me. I could stand naked on a stage and they would look the other way because they have an addiction problem. Unfortunately, when you're in an intimate relationship, when it involves betrayal, that spouse is going to feel personal. You must not love me enough. You must not find me attractive. You must not be interested. I must be not doing it the right way. And that's how spouses end up taking responsibility for the problem that isn't theirs because it's so personal. And then, by the way, us addicts say things like, well, if you were a little thinner or if you were a little younger, and so then spouses actually take on this feeling of it's my fault. Um, you know, I, um, I didn't do the right thing. I don't look the right way. I just heard about yesterday a family where a man was looking at a lot of porn, and his wife started dressing differently, acting differently, bringing toys in. She thought that if she could create this amazing sexual experience for him, that he wouldn't go out and do the things that he's doing. And the truth is, it's not about her. It's about the brokenness inside of me, my need to split intensity from intimacy. By the way, to me, that defines the problem for a sex addict, which is they confuse intimacy and intensity. When they look to get intimate needs met, they are unable to get them in their family life because they're keeping lies, they have secrets, and honestly, they don't want to be fully pulled into the responsibility that is called for in an intimate relationship. A lot of them, like me, because we grew up being completely responsible to parents and loved ones that we had to take care of. When my dad came home, he didn't say, "How was your day? How was your day at school?" He'd say, "I know you had a day at school, but let me tell you about me." I never really learned that what was inside of me was important, what was inside of me needed to be validated. But I did learn how to control getting to feeling that way. I got to control and figure out through fantasy how to make myself feel okay. And fantasy is how children survive trauma. Sometimes it's dissociative where they don't even remember and they completely disappear. And addiction, and sex addiction in particular, gives you that opportunity to completely disappear into an experience that, at least for the moment, is enough of a distraction for you not to feel, for you to get your needs met or feel better. A few things. Sex addiction is not a guy thing. I've run women's treatment programs. I've worked with women who have these issues. Sex addiction is not about taking crystal meth, although some do. It's not about hypermania or being bipolar. The reason I say that is because people who are manic will act out sexually. People who are doing meth or stimulants might act out sexually. But when I take away the meth or the drugs or the alcohol, they stop acting out. So that means to me that their problem is drugs. However, I cannot tell you, and this is one of my biggest frustrations, how many people I work with who have been to the most amazing treatment centers, the most fantastic treatment for drugs and alcohol. The problem is that no one asked them about sex. In treatment, it's sort of like there's nothing between your belly button and your thighs. We don't like to ask about that. In America, we're not even taught how to ask about that. So when you're in treatment for drugs and alcohol, I don't say, how often do you masturbate? Are you having affairs? Who have you been with other than your spouse? Have you ever had a relationship? I don't even think about those things. And the problem is that drugs and sex can be co-occurring. So I can help you stop using, but where you go for sex, who you have sex with, that's where the drugs are. So if you don't deal with this in drug and alcohol treatment and the person has any kind of paired addiction, then they're never going to stay sober because, and for the women, they have terrible relationships. They're getting hit, they're being abused, they're being ignored, and all of that kind of thing. And so when they get sober, it doesn't mean they know how to have a healthy relationship. It doesn't mean they know how to pick the right person or get loved. And as a result, many of the women I work with are in so much emotional pain based on their relationships that they can't stop drinking or using. So I think good treatment for any addiction has to ask about all of it: gambling, gaming, other, mental health, the whole thing. And the one thing we often seem to miss for whatever reason is sex. And that's part of my job. Part of why I run a program called Seeking Integrity is to deal with not only the male sex addicts, but also to deal with these people who have combined addictions and they've been unable to maintain their sobriety. It could be because of where they go for sex. It could be because they hate themselves so much for the lying, for the secrets, for that they can't tolerate how it makes them feel. And that doesn't mean they're going to go stop. It means they're going to go use. So what else do I want to talk to you about? I want to talk about spouses. So I'm going to talk some about that. I do want to go back and say that sexual sobriety is not stopping. Sexual sobriety is putting my sexual life in an organized contract. And you and I, or my sponsor, you and I, or you and your sponsor, or whoever it is, you make a contract, you agree to it, it's signed, it's written, and I am accountable as an addict to that contract, to my sponsor, to my program. And that accountability to a clearly structured, organized list of things that I can do and can't do means that I can go to a meeting and say, I've been sober. I haven't looked at porn in, I don't know, a couple of decades. I don't have sex with strangers. And since I don't do those things that were destroying my life and were clearly laid out, I'm sober. And so we can definitively define sobriety in process addictions like eating and sex, because we clearly create the circumstances under which I am able to understand when I'm sober and when I'm not. Let me see. There's one more thing I want to say about the addicts before I move on to partners. I think I want to talk to you partners. So let's do this. Second here. So I want to talk about spouses for a moment. And I think in my field, we have completely undervalued, demeaned, and not supported spouses. I am, and let me say this as clearly as I possibly can, I do not believe in codependency. I think it is an abusive label that we hang on very loving, supportive, and nurturing people who have had the strength and the courage to stay around in impossible situations to try to love us, to try to keep us sober. I also think that spouses and partners hold on to the vision and the hope of who we have been and who we might be. The idea that I would enter treatment as an addict, finally got into the treatment center, finally got sober, finally got my life together, and they turn to my family and they say, now let's talk about what's wrong with you. Let's talk about your codependency. And that makes me want to strangle them. Because when someone comes in and they finally got their spouse in and they've been living with this nightmare forever, what they need to hear is how brave you are, how courageous you are, how loving you are. You are such a strong person. I wrote a whole program about this, and my goal is to eliminate the whole focus of codependency on early relationship healing for spouses and families because you've done nothing wrong. My best example of this, and I love this because you alcoholics will totally get this and hate it, is what about the woman who's got an alcoholic husband who is drinking himself under the table and he is getting drunk and losing jobs and he's getting arrested for driving drunk, and even worse, he's picking up their children on the way home and he's drunk. And his wife, who needs that man around for money and for childcare, thinks, well, gosh, I have to get him to stop drinking at least during the day because I need him to do all of these things. And so what does she do? She hasn't gone to graduate school for addiction. She wasn't trained in addiction studies, and she's never been to a meeting. She just has an alcoholic husband she needs help from. So what does she do? She decides that one night when he comes home, she puts a cold bottle of vodka on the table and she says to her husband, you see that bottle? Every day at 4 o'clock, if you come home and you hadn't had anything to drink and you didn't lose your job and you weren't arrested for DUI and you stayed sober long enough to bring our children home, then you can drink all you want as long as you don't leave the house. Can you imagine what they would say to me in Al-Anon or AA or any, like, I'm enabling, I'm enmeshing, I'm encouraging the, I would say, what a great job that woman did. For a year or so, she got enough sobriety out of him to be able to get her kids to school and have a husband who was making money. Now, of course, we know that didn't last. And eventually he was drinking all night and then he needed to go to treatment. But at least for a period of time, with that bottle of vodka, she was able, like with a carrot hanging in front of him, she was able to get another year out of him. And to me, that's a win. To me, that's harm reduction. Did it solve the problem? No. Was it the best effort she could make? Yes. Ultimately, did her make her life easier for a period of time? Yes. Was it the answer to his sobriety? No. Why would you blame her for that? Why would you say she's enabling and enmeshing? Why wouldn't you say she did a really good job of coming up with the best solution she could under the circumstances, having no training, no knowledge, and having a family in crisis? I hate when that woman is brought into treatment or that man and they're told, well, let's talk about what's wrong with you. So I just want you to know, because I have to say it, I am very anti codependency. I'm working very hard in my career to push it out of how we look at families of addicts. And I've created a program called Prodependence. Prodependence. I want a partner who's sticking by me when I am struggling. The hard part, of course, if it's addiction and involves sex, then it's personal for the spouse and it becomes a whole different set of circumstances because, as I said, it's so personal. The emotional state of a betrayed spouse is terror, overwhelmed, like the bottom and the foundation of my life has fallen out. We call it a form of trauma. They're walking along fearing more loss, more abandonment. They're ashamed. They don't want to tell anybody. They're hating themselves. They're traumatized. They worry about the future. They worry about parenting. They worry about finances. They worry about, how am I ever going to know if this person stopped? How am I going to know if they started again? Because it's not like someone comes home drunk. You can't smell it on their breath. They're having thoughts like, oh, maybe they're with this person, or that's their experience. We call it a roller coaster. We're crazy, and I'm sorry to tell you, spouses of sex addicts, but crazy is your new norm. And one of the craziest things for spouses of sex addicts is something I call ambivalent love, which is the idea that one moment I look at you and I think, gosh, I love when you're with our kids and look how you're playing with them and you're just the best partner. And I love, and then I look at them and I say, you motherfucker, you ruined my life. You destroyed everything that was important to me and I hate you. And that challenge of both loving and hating someone at the same time makes people crazy. And that's understandable because that's not how they're used to thinking. They're also very, very angry. What I hear often from spouses is, how could you love me and do this at the same time? And of course, the answer is that I'm very, very broken and I've got a lot of problems and I have been hiding them from you. And the best way I can hide my problems from you is to go take them over there to some anonymous or distracting or affair-like experience. And then I can come home with a smile on my face because I've had a place to put all of my emotional problems and get validated and feel secure. And I can go home and look really good if I'm in that place. By the way, the problem for addicts is is I can be the most loving spouse and do all the right things. And I come home and you come home and you say, oh, honey, I love you so much. And you're the best partner I've ever had. And, all the things I want to hear, all the validation I really could ever need. Unfortunately, that afternoon, I was seeing a sex worker. And so no matter how much you say to me, I love you, I care about you, you're such a great person, I say to myself, well, if they knew what I was doing, they wouldn't say that. And so even when we do the things as sex addicts that we know would reward us with exactly what we're looking for, we can't take it in because we believe that if they really saw me, if they really knew me, they wouldn't love me. And that is one of the underlying beliefs of a sex addict is ultimately I'm unlovable as I am. But if I please you, I charm you, I be what you need me to be, or I seduce you and get me to want me, then I am okay. Then I am worthwhile. Then I can feel better. Things that will help spouses. Let me see what I want to say. They will be, first of all, spouses are in crisis for a year and a half. And of course, everyone is involved with an angry spouse thinks, well, it's been 3 months. How come you're still angry at me? Or I gave you flowers and we went on vacation. Why are you still treating me like this? And the reason is that is not a way to heal this kind of trauma. Men do not understand, in my experience, the pain that a woman goes through when she's been betrayed. Two men together, a little different. But for a man or a woman who cheats on a man, a little different. But for a woman who's deeply invested and didn't know it's her whole world, everything has changed. Her home, church, kids, family. Is she safe? What's really happening? She doesn't believe that anything that's ever happened with them before was even true. She doesn't know who she is because the whole life that she lived is no longer the life she thought she had. And so that creates trauma. And I want to say something about the addicts. We do not help clear up our relationships by saying things like, I'm really, really sorry, or I didn't really mean it, or next time it's going to be different, or I really love you and I'm trying. That doesn't, or I have so much trauma and you have to understand why I have this problem, or I'm an addict. You can see why I'm struggling with this. Spouses don't care about that. They're not, they're not ready to stop being hurt and betrayed because the addict says, well, it's been 3 months. It's about time. They're done when they're done. And the only way that a spouse can begin to trust a relationship that's been betrayed is behavior. Do I go to meetings? Do I have a sponsor? Am I going to therapy? Can you predictably know when I'm doing what I need to be doing? And you're not nagging me. You're not saying, did you go to that meeting? I am taking responsibility for my recovery, and you see that. And in seeing those recovery behaviors over time, and I mean a year or more, I begin to rely on your recovery. And as such, I begin to trust other parts of your life. And that's how recovery happens by all of us, which is I begin to trust that the behavior and actions of the person I love are matching up with who they are. Some quick questions I get asked that I'm going to answer for you. What about couples having sex when there's been betrayal? It's not unusual for a spouse to jump in and start to have a lot of sex once they find out about this because they want to make sure the person stays in the relationship or because they want to make sure that they feel loved or convinced and let me tell you, here's a reason to not have sex when sex addiction has recently been discovered. Why would you have sex with someone you don't trust? Until trust is restored, sexuality in this relationship is going to be a lie. And by the way, it's really helpful if you are involved with a sex addict to kick them out of your bed. Let them sleep in another room. Let them sleep on the sofa. Let them go somewhere else. Let them understand how you've been feeling for so long, which is abandoned, unloved, distant, and all those kinds of things. I think I don't have a lot of time. I think I'm supposed to stop at the quarter hour. So I'm just going to say to you that, for addicts, there's SAA, SA, SCA, SLA, SRA. You can't find, and then Porn Addicts Anonymous. We have plenty of programs, and partners have S-Anon and Al-Anon and COSA and all of that stuff. If you want to understand this in the most effective way possible, and I think I have to stop, right? Someone nod and say yes. I have a podcast. I already have over 1 million downloads. people who are dealing with betrayal, sex addiction, love addiction, they listen to this in their cars. They say to their addicted spouses, you listen to this. And it's called Sex, Love, and Addiction. Sex, Love, and Addiction. It will absolutely be helpful. I don't make any money from podcasts, but to hear how it plays out, to listen to professionals being talked to, you will begin to put the whole thing together. And that's why I did it. That's why we give it away. If you go to our website, seekingintegrity.com, Seeking Integrity, there are 14 free groups that I have addicts, therapists moderate. So betrayed spouses, older betrayed spouses, gay sex addicts, straight sex addicts, drug addicted sex addicts. I give all of this away for free because I want people to find recovery. Do we have paid stuff? Absolutely. Do I have books and a treatment program here and all of that stuff? Absolutely. That pays for my ability to do stuff like this at no cost. Lectures, trainings, podcasts, blogs. The work we do allows me to give this away. And for me, this is service. I sponsored a lot of people. I've done a lot of work. I brought coffee into meetings. But at this level of experience, I can help people in a much larger way. And for me, that is service. I have written, and I don't know if we're able to talk about this, but too late now. I've written 4 books that I would mention that are helpful. Cruise Control is a book for gay men. Sex Addiction 101 is an introduction to the issue. Out of the Doghouse is a book for men who have no idea how to heal their intimate relationships, and it tells them exactly how to do that. And Prodependency is a book about pushing codependency aside and moving on to a much more positive, strength-based, loving way to look at families and parents. And let me tell you one thing I want to say about Prodependence, because it's so important to me. When I talk about the failure of codependency, it's not a diagnosis. It's never been a diagnosis. There's no research for it. I could go on and on and on. The reality is it doesn't exist. It's a pop culture notion. No, there's never been codependency. As a therapist, as a psychiatrist, it's not listed in any of our manuals because it doesn't exist as a formal diagnosis. It is a pop culture notion. One of the things that happens when I talk about this, and I really will stop here, when I talk about this, is when I talk about how families have done their best to love someone, when even if they didn't know how, even if they were enabling and meshing and all, that they were really came from love and doing the best they could to try to help someone, even if that person didn't make it. How many people have been told, oh, well, if you weren't so codependent, how many parents have blamed themselves for a child's loss in addiction? And I can't tell you when I do that lecture how many people come to me in tears and say, I have thought for so many years that this was my fault. And the meetings I went to and the books I read told me it was my fault. And if I just worked on this or just worked on that, and they're crying because I'm the first person to say to them, this is not your fault. All you did was the best you could to love that addict. And that, by the way, is the most important thing to me in 9 books, is the opportunity to help families be more loving in the process of understanding and living with addiction.